Welcome to the One State Palestine broadcast. Recently formed One State in Palestine campaigns for what it says on the tin, that from the river to the sea, Palestine must be free. A democratic state where Muslims, Christians and Jews live as equal citizens under the law. One man, one woman, one vote. It was good enough for post-apartheid South Africa. It must surely be the answer to post-apartheid Israel-Palestine. Now, as the world's attention fixates necessarily on other theatres of conflict, other great summits, other huge issues and threats in the world, we're determined not to lose sight of this fact, that Palestine is the moral centre of the world. It is situated in the colonial era. It is the last great anti-colonial struggle. Of course, neocolonialism has supplanted actual colonialism and can be just as pernicious a foe. But the European settler state that was established in Palestine belongs in the same drawer as the white settler states of South Africa, of Zimbabwe, Rhodesia, of Zambia, of Nyasaland, of Portuguese Mozambique, of Portuguese Angola, Portuguese Cape Verde. It is in the same block as French Indochina, what a thought, as Dutch East Indies. These were expressions of sometimes ethno-religious supremacism. That because we were bigger, because we were more developed, because we had bigger guns than them, we had the right to take their countries and ruthlessly exploit them for ourselves. And, for that matter, seizing not only the land and the resources of those countries, but in the era of slavery, to take the very human beings themselves and transport them in chains in the bowels of ships across the Atlantic, to work them then as beasts of burden. Israel-Palestine belongs in that same box. Now, the fact that the other failed European settler states, the fact that the Belgians, the Dutch, the French, the British, and others cling so furiously to their support for the settler state in Israel-Palestine is testament to how they see the settlers in Palestine as people like us, as people like them. They know, even if some of our people don't, that this is the last great anti-colonial study. And we are determined that the situation in Palestine this day of mass murder and genocide, of starvation and thirst, and of the complicity, the collaboration, the active collaboration, in many, many cases, of the imperialist countries of the globe in that genocide must never be forgotten. I was on record in the week of saying this: the only cash or compromise can fully explain just how vast the expenditure of political capital by Western countries in support of Israel. But there is a third reason, and I've just alluded to it. And that third reason is that they are not ready to let the idea of colonialism die. They are not ready to relinquish their previously open beliefs that some countries, some civilizations have the right to supplant others, have the right to occupy and to exploit others, that some people are more equal than others. So the fact that we are now almost 2 years into what by any metric is a genocidal slaughter, if what's happening in Gaza is not genocide, well, what would genocide be? It is estimated by Israeli sources that as many as 1/5 of the Palestinian people in Gaza have been ruthlessly and deliberately eliminated. There is no question about the word deliberately, as we saw in the murder of 5 Al Jazeera journalists and film crew earlier this week. These people deliberately target the people that they are slaughtering, including the women and the children. The facts are that Ukraine, even Iran, are competing for headspace, are competing for media space, competing for the attention of the world's political leaders, if they can be so called. And therefore it's our duty to keep returning Palestine to the center of the stage. And that's one of the things that one state in Palestine is determined to do. But it has another side to it. And every day, all of us on the platform tonight, and maybe many of you, have to face the cry of despair that one democratic state in Palestine is some kind of unicorn, is some kind of unachievable aim. Some of the people who say that try to pretend, or have maybe even fooled themselves, that the so-called two-state solution, which isn't even a solution, even if it were implemented, has some chance of being realized. Smotrich today gave a license for thousands more illegal settlement houses and other installations at the gigantic settlement of Ma'ale Adumim, just outside Jerusalem. To call it a settlement is a misnomer. Ma'ale Adumim is like a medium-sized city. It is skyscrapers, it is sprinklers and lawns and swimming pools and schools and facilities of all kinds. These settlements are never going to be removed as part of any two-state solution. And hundreds of thousands of illegal Israeli settlers are now fully ensconced on the land that was earmarked in 1993 as the territory of the Palestinian state within a two-state solution. So unless you're going to say to me that Netayahu, Ben-Gvir, Smotrich are going to knock all these settlements down, are going to drag all these settlers off this land, then where is the Palestinian state going to be in a two-state solution? In any case, the Israelis have made it plain. The Knesset 2 weeks ago passed a resolution with a tiny handful against to declare that the West Bank was part of Israel. Netanyahu himself, ruminating on television just a day or two ago, told us how attached he was to the greater Israel concept. That is to say, not just Gaza, Jerusalem and the West Bank, but parts of Egypt, parts of Lebanon, of Syria, of Jordan, of Saudi Arabia and of Iraq. That's the greater Israel that they have in mind, not a smaller Israel in a so-called two-state solution. But even if there had been a two-state solution implemented, what about the millions of Palestinians in exile across the globe? What about their inalienable right to return that was specifically excluded by the two-state solution? Why am I dwelling on this? Because all kinds of Western governments that have supported this slaughter for nearly 2 years are now saying, well, in September, it's always in September, a few months down the road, they are going to recognize the Palestinian state. Well, look, we're not against them doing that. It's a propaganda step. If the Israelis hate it, well, We should love it. But what does it mean in practice? In practice, it means nothing at all. What Palestinian state are you recognizing? Are you recognizing the areas of the West Bank where that state was supposed to be, which have now been concreted, paved over, and turned into virtual cities of Israeli settlers? Are you recognizing the Palestinian state, which includes the Gaza Strip, now looking and no doubt feeling like Hiroshima 2.0? Are you recognizing the Palestinian capital of East Jerusalem? They used to talk about maybe nudging the map a little bit so that some places like Silwan, which are not even in Jerusalem, could be called Jerusalem, and that could be the capital of the Palestinian state. Well, Israel is busy knocking down Palestinian homes, knocking down, sequestering and seizing religious properties belonging to Armenians, belonging to other Christian denominations. Soon there will be nothing left that could conceivably be described as the Palestinian part of a two-state solution. So we struggle for what is the best solution. We struggle for the only thing that is actually a solution, which is one democratic state from the river to the sea, where Palestine can be free and where the Palestinian people abroad, in exile, in refugee camps, and in penury in nearby countries and many, many others, may return to their legitimate homes, their lands, and recover their rights. If you agree with us, you should at least support us. We're everywhere now. We're on TikTok, on Rumble, on Twitter, on Facebook. You should definitely add your name, your voice in support of what we are fighting for. And you should volunteer to become active in the campaign for one state in Palestine. Now we've got an array of guests for this presentation tonight, and so I shan't delay their appearance any longer. First up is Mr. Ousman Noor, who is a barrister and is the founder of Protest Palestine, and for that matter, we hope will accept my invitation to be the leader of one state in Palestine. Ousman, the floor is yours. Tell us how you see things.
Thank you, George. Your necessity, the reality of the one state project. It actually brings the Workers' Party, in my view, to the forefront of the Palestinian resistance, in that it actually represents the Palestinian position better than the Palestinian administration does. The one state idea is based on what Palestine has always been, actually, a place of welcoming, a place where Jews, Christians, Muslims have lived together side by side for centuries. They didn't even have the necessity for the border security state that now exists, because the idea was welcoming. And so what we are doing is calling back for what has always been true for Palestine, and acknowledging that, as you said very eloquently, George, that the two-state is actually the unicorn here. The one state is not. The two-state, it is a figment of people's imaginations. There is no two-state. It is an ethno-nationalist death cult that is eradicating the indigenous people, and has been doing so for decades. It is not just eradicating the people, it is eradicating the landscape, it is destroying the natural habitat. It is, in my view, and I mean this literally, it is a parasite, in that it pretends to be its host, it sucks life out of its host and drains it for all it's worth, and carries on destroying it and pretends to be it. That is the nature of Zionism. It plants itself. And I think in the first place, it did that to the Jewish religion by posing as a spokes representative for the Jewish people. It is not that. It masquerades as Jewish, but nothing could be more treacherous to the actual teachings of the religion. It then supplants itself in Palestine and commits ethnic cleansing of the indigenous people and pretends that it is them. And now it is a parasite on all Western allies that have put themselves in their ship. We see the Western states tearing up basic norms of international law, basic norms of international customs. What won't they do to protect Israel? So it is tearing up everything that it relates to. So it needs to be addressed for what it is, a sick ideology that is based on race supremacy and has obviously now been eradicating literally everything around it. What I will say, though, George, the one-state solution is the right solution. It is an urgent solution, but there is one step towards that is perhaps even more urgent, which is that, in truth, Israel is exterminating everyone in Gaza. It is committed ideologically to that. It cannot stand the existence of the Palestinian people, and therefore it is in the mode of extermination or expulsion, right? And we see that there are hundreds of trucks of food and aid all around Gaza, and yet on the other hand, we see emaciated children. We need to get into the mode now where we understand Israel for what it is. We've had 22 months, and those of us who've been following Palestine and Israel for longer have known for a long time that Israel cannot be negotiated with. The Palestinian resistance has known this, has been trying to inform us of this. Israel cannot be negotiated with. It is peak violence. It is hell-bent on eradication. So we need to get out of this frame of mind where there's ceasefire discussions or there's notions that there's going to be some resolution or some summit that might take place. They are eradicating the Palestinian people, and there is therefore an urgent imperative, a legal obligation, in fact, of a military intervention. I think a lot of the people, perhaps on the left, are anti-war, as I am, have shied away from this because of the history of imperialism. But what we also need to do is grapple with reality, which is that unless these food trucks are delivered urgently tomorrow, in fact, yesterday, to the people, then they will all die, right? So, in fact, this call for a military intervention, it is not just a humanitarian and moral imperative, but it is actually what international law says should happen. When we acknowledge that there is a genocide, actually, there isn't a more universally adopted and agreed norm in the world that we should prevent genocide. And that includes an obligation to take military action to stop it. So we have been in the frame of mind primarily within the Palestine activist camp of boycotts, divestments, and sanctions, and these are crucial, but they are ultimately a way of reducing our own complicity in the project, which is necessary. But we also need to proactively stop the extermination. We have seen attempts made by civilians like the Freedom Flotilla. I was on the march to Gaza where we tried to get to the border. More of these flotillas are coming, and Israel is simply either bombing them or kidnapping the people on board. Therefore, we need to get in. We shouldn't go there with the attitude that we're going to get arrested. We need to go there with the attitude that we're going to get in and break the siege to implement a no-fly zone. Basic requirements. Israel is going to carry on killing until this happens. And no point in talking about one state if the eradication happens, right? So we need to, that is the urgent imperative. So I founded the Protect Palestine campaign, and it's been very clear in the response to the campaign that has been what most people are feeling is the right course of action, but we need to now channel that into political mobilization. And the Workers' Party, obviously receptive to the demands of the Palestinian people, have said one state is the right solution. We also need leadership, I think, on the call for a military intervention as well. But look, we need to be true to the ideals of what we stand for. We are anti-racist. We are anti-apartheid. We believe in the idea that there is a fraternity at the core between humanity, and that there is scope, there is hope for a better future, and therefore we must call for a one state. That is the only thing worth fighting for. And that is what the Palestinians, especially those involved in the armed resistance, have always acknowledged is the right way forward.
Amen, and a very useful corrective. Of course, there will be no one state if there are no Palestinians left alive or on the territory to form it. And I strongly support the call that you have just made for international intervention. The Chapter 7 provisions of the United Nations Charter and the tried and tested method in the Security Council in the past was that a Chapter 7 emergency is declared and the Security Council empowers any and all of its members to insert themselves in a physical, kinetic, military intervention to stop genocide, to stop slaughter. Now, of course, the United States would veto any such Chapter 7 resolution. But then we, perhaps unusually, can rely on the new doctrine of RTP, the right to protect, which Tony Blair and Bill Clinton invented in Chicago in the 1990s, and which was used to justify the intervention of big powers in what they said were genocidal situations when they could not get agreement in the Security Council. So my position is, Chapter 7 now, if America vetoes it, then the willing should form a coalition and should enter the Gaza Strip to bring the killing to a halt. That's not just moral, that's not just the right thing to do, it is the only legal course of action. It is illegal to see a genocide going on and not to do anything, everything that you can to bring it to an end. And this is, as you say, been slow to be picked up by people on the left because it looked like another foreign intervention. But frankly, this has reached such a critical stage that there can be no justification for big powers, especially big powers like China, big powers like Russia, big powers like Turkey, for standing on the sidelines and wringing their hands whilst an entire people are exterminated. Thank you, Ousman. Let's turn to Dr. Rahmeh Aladwan, who is herself part Palestinian and a British NHS doctor. Doctor, welcome to One State Palestine and this broadcast. Give us your perspective, please, on these issues.
Thank you for having me. I would like to echo what you said regarding the journalists that were brutally assassinated 3.5 days ago, and mention Anas Sharif. I personally knew Anas, and just like for me, he was family. I'm sure it was to millions of others across the world, and the grief is heavy. But I'd like to mention what he said in his will, which was that he grew up knowing that his family were from Al-Majdan, Asqalan, which is a mere 10 minutes from Jabalia, beyond the military fence that they are trapped inside of in Gaza. And he said that he'd hoped that he would go home. And I think that relates to the one state, because his family, his grandparents, great-grandparents, obviously grew up in Asqalan, and it was Jewish refugees that came by boat to Asqalan and expelled his family at gunpoint, forced them away from their homes. And his family, along with 250,000 other Palestinians, were driven into Gaza, what is now Gaza, because original Gaza is not Gaza now, it actually extends further. But these were the colonial borders imposed on them by the entity that was then established during the Nakba. But that's relates exactly to the one state, because for Palestinians, their liberation struggle is guided by the principles of Palestinian liberation. They're called al-Thawabit, and these were formed from the National Charter in 1960 and finalized in 1968. So Palestinians have actually already decided what their liberation looks like. And I think people don't get to see this, because when you look at mainstream media, especially in the West, you will have Israeli officials, you will have IOF spokespeople, you might have anti-Zionist Jews, and you might have people speaking that are on the pro-Palestine side. But never do you see a Palestinian official, never do you see a Palestinian from Gaza, a journalist from Gaza speak to the Western public. And I think that's where this narrative gets lost. The Thawabit were decided upon unanimously by all political factions in 1968. And they are that Palestine is Arab from the river to the sea, and Al-Quds, Jerusalem, is its capital. That's exactly what you're saying with the one state. So if anything, you've stepped into the actual narrative of Palestinians, which everybody else has been speaking in terms that do not align with what Palestinians have already decided. And the rest are that, armed resistance is a right enshrined in international law. So condemning armed resistance for Palestinians is condemning them to not be able to have, firstly, their human right that anybody would have and should have, and condemning them to not be able to defend themselves. And the third one is that we don't normalize. So Israel is a terrorist entity. It was established through terrorism against the British forces first to drive them out, and then Palestinians second, and it has continued, established on genocide, continues on genocide, and now a full-blown Holocaust. So we don't actually recognize that Israel exists. For us, it just sits on top of Palestine, and the goal is that it is dismantled and Palestine can breathe and it's free. And so we don't normalize, we don't recognize that it exists, we don't normalize relations with it, and we don't normalize with organizations or individuals who recognize it, because it contradicts the principles. And if we don't have the principles that we're aligned on, then we're never going to achieve our goal. And I think the main point in the Thawabit, the principles that might differ from what you're talking about, is that obviously the colonialism in Palestine, it's a settler colony made up of European Jews that arrived, but it was started through religious groups, Jewish religious groups. Actually, the first Jewish-only settlement created in Palestine were Jews from Jerusalem in Palestine who went over to Jaffa and tried to establish a Jewish-only settlement driven by religious messianic beliefs to take over Palestine and establish what is called in the Torah as Eretz Israel, which is what more religious Jews will pray to, next year in Jerusalem, etc. So, of course, there is what they say is an ethno-nationalist element, but there is a very big religious element. And I think we are doing ourselves a disservice if we don't talk about the theological grounding, whether political Zionism came later, so the religious groups started to migrate to Palestine with religious aspirations to take over Palestine, and political Zionism came later and propagated it and validated it through political means. And that's how then you had more mass immigration, and they call it birthright aliyah. Basically, it's manifest destiny, right? But the first aliyah was religious, and it was in 1881. So this is the final principle of liberation, which is that pre-1880 Jews in Palestine are Palestinian Jews. The ones that came up after that are not Palestinian Jews and are actually colonial Jewish refugees who have spent the past 100 years benefiting from an apartheid genocidal system that benefits Jews at the expense of Christians and Muslims. So I think it's a great step, the one state, and the next step to that would be to talk about decolonization. Of course, Palestine will be open to everybody. That's how it was before. But at the end of the day, if we want to see Palestinians as equals, we want to make sure that we understand that when the 7 million Palestinians in exile come back, they will choose what happens. They will decide what kind of government. They will decide if they want to be secular or not. That's our position, is to support them and what they want for their future. That's how we see them as equals.
Well, of course, and I didn't use the word secular, I said democratic, and the democratic state of Palestine will have to decide its own composition. But the inalienable right of the 7 million Palestinians living outside of the country to return to their country has to be a basic principle of our campaign, and it is. Equally, no one has the right, however long they have been there, whether it's 70 years or 100 years, no one has the right to live in someone else's house, on someone else's land, to which they have title. It doesn't matter if you were able to drive away the rightful owners of the house, of the land, of the farm. It doesn't matter if they then have died. Their children and their children will always be the rightful owners of that land. No doubt, some of today's Israelis would, just as some of today's white South Africans after apartheid, would choose to leave. I personally think the great majority of them would choose to leave because they have enjoyed living as the supremacists, as the chosen ones, on someone else's land, in someone else's house, and they're not ready to make way for the returning rightful owners. But those who did seek to stay in that one democratic Palestine would definitely have to atone for the atrocity of this long period of colonialism from which they and their ancestors have benefited.
Of course.
So I don't think we are necessarily apart on that question. My position would be this is a matter for the Palestinian people in their democracy, in their one state. So thanks, Doctor, for a spirited contribution. Very nice to meet you for the first time. Let me go to someone who I'm definitely not meeting for the first time, a very close friend of mine. Christopher Helali is an international analyst, geopolitical expert.
It's a pleasure to be with you, George. Thank you so much for inviting me and for having me on. Of course, the one-state Palestine
it's all yours.
Solution is the only solution that we have now available to us, and it is the principled solution to this ongoing real horror and tragedy for the past century. And for us, I think that it's important to hold the Zionists to account for their constant propaganda about being the quote-unquote only democracy in the Middle East. They always, you know this, it's the common refrain, we are the only democracy in the region. Okay, if you are a democracy, give democracy to everyone, including the people you occupy, including the people that you control, including the people that are under your military observation and structures and terror. And so in that way, we can undo the apartheid from within, just like in South Africa, just like, as you mentioned, in Rhodesia. Of course, there was an armed struggle, which was very important, but the moral call was a critical component. And the moral call didn't only come from Black South Africans or Blacks in Rhodesia, eventually Zimbabwe. It came from also Jews, as you yourself have noted many times, very prominent Jews in South Africa and in Europe and in the US and abroad were campaigning for an end to apartheid. And very prominent Jews today, by the millions, are fighting for a free Palestine because they say, once again, not in our name. And I think it's important to recognize that the land of Palestine is for everyone, for Christians, Muslims, Jews, Druze, for agnostics, for atheists, for whatever you want. It has always been that. It has always been an area where the three major Abrahamic faiths have come to pray in their respective areas, in their respective ways and traditions, but also a place where many could find a home and refuge. Many other minorities, including Kurds, including Alawites, including Druze, including Greeks, many others of all shapes and sizes and identities. And I think that that's so critical at this point that clearly, I think we can at first say that the Zionist project, as is well established, is a racist project. The UN General Assembly already approved that and recognized that in 1975, as we are familiar with. That Zionism is a form of racism, is a form of racial discrimination. If that is the case, there can be no future for everyone in that land if, of course, it is a land that is ultimately for only one group, that it privileges only one strata of that society. So, of course, the nation state law that was passed just a few years ago violates any principle of democracy, violates the basic human rights and human dignity of all of the people of that land, because it says that this is inherently a Jewish state, and only Jews in this state have the right to self-determination. Well, of course, you cannot have a state like that at this point that is solely ethno-religious and claim at the same time, claim simultaneously that it is somehow a democratic state and a state that is upholding human rights, human values, and human dignity. It simply isn't the case. You can have an ethno-religious state, but that state is ultimately one that is fascistic, one that violates the basic dignity of people who do not constitute the majority or the included group, the group that is recognized by law. And ultimately, it cannot have any claim to any moral or ethical compass because it excludes others from its own fruits of the state and ultimately of the rights that the state provides. So I think that the one state project, which has been pushed by many, and we know many of our friends like Ilan Pape and many others have been talking about this for many, many years, that ultimately the Zionist project is going to come to a head when it has to confront the reality that it controls the lives and destinies of millions of people under its control and under its regime, its legal regime, its military regime, its political regime. And with that, it ultimately will have to come to a crossroads, whether it will continue to ethnically cleanse and commit this horrific genocide, not only in Gaza, but also in the West Bank and in occupied East Jerusalem, or if we are going to campaign hard enough to say that that state can no longer be an apartheid state, it must be a state for everyone. And that is regardless of their ethnic, religious identity. That's the real crux of what we are speaking about here. One state from the river to the sea for rights for everyone. You know as well as I do that these settlers, which number now over 800,000 in the occupied West Bank, they're not going anywhere at this point. And if they are forced out, it will not be like Gaza 2 decades ago where settlers were forced out and dragged from their houses. We're going to see armed conflict. Already, Israeli media is speaking about civil war as a possibility within Israeli society, given the factions that exist between religious Jews who don't want to serve in the so-called Israeli Defense Forces, given the fact that there are secular Jews who are having big issues with the religious side. There's a lot of fragmentation. Of course, there's an overwhelming majority that are very much fascistic and very much supportive of the genocidal policies. But there is still divisions within Israeli society. And Netanyahu is not so strong in his political position. He has an ongoing case. So the society itself is also very much on shaky ground. It's a house of cards built on sand. It's only a matter of time before its internal contradictions basically bring us to a point where we have to deal with these head on. And I think that our campaign, One State Palestine, and the global campaign for Palestine can ultimately affect a major transformation and change by really pushing for an inclusive state for everyone. Hold them accountable and say, okay, you want to be democratic, give the rights to all of the people that you occupy. And if those rights are given, of course, you ultimately run into the demographic situation, which of course is the biggest fear for the Israelis, that they are going to be outnumbered. But that's just the reality of the case. They came to a land already populated. You know, you say it oftentimes that, well, one group of people promise another group of people a third, group of people's land. And ultimately, the Palestinian people had no say in this situation, but they deserve a say now. If the West wants to continue to push that they have some moral compass, some ethical codes, some principles of human rights, then ultimately the only solution is to guarantee those rights for everyone from the river to the sea and let the politics play out. But if it's going to be democratic, then the ballot box has to be respected. The ballot box was not respected in Gaza, as we well know, and the ballot box has not been respected in many parts of the region and in large part around the world if it doesn't conform to what the West wants. But we must respect ultimately what that ballot box will look like. This two-state solution for me is dead at this point. I cannot foresee any real, tangible path forward for the two-state solution at this point. And I think that the recent pronouncements over the past few weeks are clear that there is a rapid push towards annexation, towards settlement advancement, as you rightly pointed out, with the recent statement by Smotrich, and also Ben-Gvir is talking about it. Everyone is speaking about this is the moment for Judea and Samaria. So if that's the case, now we're going to move to the next level of fight, and that's the fight ultimately for the rights of the people within that occupied land to have full political, economic, social rights in that land. Even if they are occupied, they deserve a right at the ballot box, and that ballot box will decide the future of that land. And we know where that land will go if everyone is guaranteed that right in that land, both 48 borders and now all of the occupied territories, the entirety of historic Palestine. If it's given the right, we know that the Zionist project will fail the next day.
Amen. And you brilliantly highlighted the contradictions that contain within them the beginning of the end of this Zionist state enterprise. You cannot simultaneously claim that this land, Judea, Samaria, even give it your name, is yours, but the people who live in it and have lived in it for millennia, who have land title to it, have no rights at all. That is the very definition of apartheid. And if you call it what it is, you make it much more difficult for Western governments, politicians, journalists, or just ordinary people to openly support it. Who wants to say that they are a supporter of apartheid? And the truth is, the Zionist project depended upon the mass transfer of all Palestinians from the land that they were occupying, and they failed to achieve that. They drove out 800,000 people, but their children and their children and their children have never forgotten where they come from. Ben Gurion said, the old will forget, but they never forgot, and they passed on their very clear memories of their own land, their own houses, their own orchards, their own orange trees. They passed them on to their children and their grandchildren, and those grandchildren are as determined to return to their land, to return to their homes, as their grandparents, great-grandparents were. So we give ourselves in this campaign the moral high ground. We are the people who say we want a democracy. You say you're a democracy, we want a democracy. From the river to the sea, where every person living there has the right to vote and choose their system of government and their representatives. Moreover, we are the only people who say that the Palestinians driven into Gaza in their hundreds of thousands from 10 miles away, like Anas al-Sharif, 10 minutes away is his house, his land, but he lived and he died in a refugee camp called Jabalia in Gaza, able to see through the fence his own house, his own land, but never to be allowed to return to it. This cannot be accepted by any normal person. It is called an inalienable right for a reason. It's a right that no one can take away from you. It is your inalienable human legal right to return to the land from which you have been driven, however long it takes, however many generations that it takes. That was Christopher Helali, the great geopolitical strategist and analyst. I told you he was good, and he proved it. Our final speaker this evening is an old friend of mine too. She and I travelled to Iraq under sanctions, under bombardment, and under the threat of cataclysmic war. And from Iraq, we went directly to the occupied Palestinian territories of Jenin and the Jenin refugee camp, which, like the Jabalia camp in Gaza, is a camp where from the rooftops you can actually see your own house and your own land occupied by foreigners who came from New York, from London, from Paris, or from Moscow. That Jenin camp had then recently been subject to a massacre of the kind with which we've had to become so familiar in Gaza and elsewhere. She is Yvonne Ridley. She is a journalist of note, a journalist and broadcaster and political activist, and the lead candidate for the Workers' Party in the upcoming Scottish Parliament elections in Glasgow in May of next year. She will be the final speaker. Yvonne Ridley, the floor is yours.
Thank you, George. Well, I was so impressed when you and Chris Williamson unveiled the one solution, one state, one Palestine. And it is so obvious because you just have to look at the map of Palestine at the moment and all those little bantustans that are in the occupied West Bank. And then, of course, there is Gaza. And there is no way in God's earth that you could see a two-state solution being a reality. And anybody with the slightest degree of common sense would be able to look at that map, that ever-shrinking map, and see that it is impossible for the Palestinians to live in a two-state. And this was not lost at all on the founder of Hamas, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, who he was a quadriplegic and partially blind, but he was the spiritual leader of the of Hamas, and he could see quite clearly that there could only be one state in Palestine. So, with all due respect, your announcement last week was actually on the list of Sheikh Yassin, who said it is not enough to have a state in the West Bank and Gaza. The best solution is to let all Christians, Jews and Muslims live in Palestine. Now, then, you were talking earlier about from the river to the sea, and we've had Zionists up in arms saying this is an anti-Semitic saying. Again, they've dominated this narrative, and anyone who challenges it is called anti-Semitic. And yet the whole world says nothing, as it did yesterday when Benjamin Netanyahu talked about his vision for a greater Israel, which would take a big chunk of Egypt and Jordan and part of Saudi Arabia and part of Yemen, and basically a land grab of a huge swathe of the Middle East. But nobody jumps up and down and says he wants to wipe Palestine off the map. which he does, and he's made that quite clear in his treatment of Gaza, but he also wants to wipe off part of Egypt, part of Jordan, and nobody challenged him when he made this announcement just yesterday on one of the Israeli channels, that he feels very attached, and he's invoking this religious vision that he's having of a greater Israel. And he, in fact, said during this interview yesterday that he's on a historic and spiritual mission. Now, can you imagine if the Hamas leadership started talking like this? It would be a cause for another war. And I do wish that the Arab nations would grow a spine. And this was something that really shocked me when you took me to Jenin. We listened to the mayor of Jenin give us a military briefing of what was happening in Jenin, and at that time there was a massacre, and they had to stop fighting, not because they wanted to surrender, but because the siege into Jenin was so tight that they couldn't get any, not even a single bullet through the siege from their Arab neighbors. You know, and I'm sick of hearing about the Arab neighbors who despair about what's happening in Palestine. They held that siege so tight on their brothers and sisters in Jenin that not even one single bullet could be smuggled in. And the resistance, which has a perfectly legal right under international law to resist the occupation, the resistance had to give up. They didn't want to surrender, and it would be wrong to say that they surrendered, but they had no ammunition. They had run out of weaponry, and it was shocking to me to realize that the Arab states don't have a great affinity with the Palestinian people, although the Arab people do. And I really despair of the Arab people because, you know, if they just had the guts to rise up, and it's easy for me saying that sitting in Scotland, but if the Arab people just had the guts to rise up, they would see that these powerful Arab leaders are not as powerful as they want us all to believe. And the anger coming out of Gaza towards the neighboring Arab nations is really palpable. And I have often said that if Algeria and Turkey were neighbors of Palestine, it would have been liberated by now, in my humble opinion. But
well, your opinions are seldom humble. They are your own, and you defend them with spirit and eloquence, as you have done again this evening. Just for the record, we as an organization do not support any specific Palestinian organization, not at all. We all have different friends and relations, if you like. I myself have long been a supporter of the Arafatist camp and of the imprisoned leader Marwan al-Barghouti, who I happen to believe would be the best president for the Palestinian state. But others have different points of view. Some are of the left, some are of the religious currents and points of view. None of that is of any importance. Neither is our campaign in any way a blow against people who don't support the one-state solution inside Palestine. This is not against anybody. This is our honest appraisal that only one-state solution can resolve this conflict and the rights of the Palestinian people. But we are in solidarity with all Palestinians, whatever their political hue, whatever their attitude is to the ultimate solution of this. We will always be found on the political battlefield alongside all people of goodwill who stand with Palestine. It's marvellous. Thanks, Yvonne. Thanks to all of the speakers this evening. Above all, thanks to you for watching. And make sure you follow us on every one of our social media platforms. This has been the first, it won't be the last rally of one state in Palestine. Thanks for watching.